Well, it's certainly been a while since we last touched this franchise, hasn't it? Hello everyone and welcome to Let's Play Castlevania The Adventure. Notably I'm playing the Game Boy release, as there is one other release of this, not counting its remake, but I'll talk about that in a moment. That was the entire reason I wanted to do that little break. So notably I'm saying I'm playing the Game Boy release. There is a Game Boy Color release of this with full color and slightly sped up movement, although it makes the slowdown a lot more obvious. But that was only released in Japan and the PAL regions as part of a 4-in-1 pack cartridge that I think had one of the Contra games, one of the Gradius games, I think, and some racing game, I want to say. There is also notably a Castlevania The Adventure DX fan patch that roughly fixes some of the issues that that version has. But I wanted to stick with the original for this because it's the version I first tried. To start off, let's talk about mechanics, because while there's a lot of overlap, things are a little off in this game for reasons. For one thing, while you still got jumping, whipping, and all that jazz, Christopher Belmont, who's the playable character in this game, despite what the American manual might tell you, is incredibly slow on his feet compared to even the struttiest of the other Belmonts. And that means the timer at the top of the screen is an active threat in this game, unlike most other Castlevanias. You're still whipping at candles to get stuff, however, they don't drop hearts, which are sub-weapon ammo in this. Hearts are actually your health pickups. If they're a solid heart, I believe it's a lower amount of health. If they're a flashing heart, it's a full health recovery, or at least closer to it. Coins are entirely for score, otherwise there's 1-ups and crucifixes, which are invincibility, just like in Classic Vania on the NES. On top of that, there's also whip power-ups that can drop. However, whip power-ups work a little differently in this game than most. If you get hit, you lose a level of your whip power. So, if you want to have a long whip that even fires a fireball when you hit the button, you need to make sure you're not getting hit as best as possible. In that regard, the constant slowdown and slow strut can actually have a bit of an advantage because it gives you more time to absorb what enemy patterns might be. But even then, because of this, they do actively place whip power-ups more frequently than they do in other classic Vanias. The jump angle is also a little rough in this game. That's just because control-wise, this game is real bad feeling. Which I can understand in one regard, but I'll talk about that later. For right now, let's talk about the plot as it's listed in the American manual, as well as in the Japanese manual. By the way, hidden bonus room up here. Let's start by reading the translated version of the Japanese manual. I'm finding this translation via the Castlevania fandom site, by the way. Transylvania, a small country in Europe, is associated even today with the demon's legend. With his powerful evil power, that's redundant sounding, the legacy of Count Dracula has been dreaded by the people. However, no matter how many times Dracula comes back, he never manages to fully change the world into darkness, as he is always put away by Simon, a descendant of the Belmont clan. However, the devil Dracula has existed long before his first confrontation. Not as the devil Dracula, but as an evil sorcerer. Count Dracula was a fanatical demon worshipper who built a dark castle at the outskirts of Transylvania and conducted evil rituals every night. He has summoned several demons from the other world to serve him, and he himself has been trying to get eternal life by becoming a demon king possessing evil powers. With each day, Count Dracula's evil powers became more frightening as he spread fear and terror to the people of the village, until one day a man stood up. It was Christopher, an ancestor of the Belmont family. Christopher rushed to the dark castle. Many demons and traps laid out are waiting for him at the castle. Will he be able to defeat the transformed devil, Count Dracula, as expected? I mean, given the fact there's lore after this, I'd say so. Before we read the American manual's narrative, as loose as it is, some things to watch out for in this screen. The birds we've seen throughout the stage already, the way they work is they'll dash across the screen, but when they hit the opposite side from where they spawn, they'll dive down towards you. I'd recommend just getting about halfway across the screen from them and then just waiting for them to dive down so you can avoid losing your power up. But also, we got collapsing blocks in this stage that will fall when you step on them. They appear in many of the game stages even. This game's jump arc is tight enough where some of them are a surprising threat even this early, as there's enough weight to Christopher's movement in jumps where any height you lose from a collapsing platform like that could be height that gets you killed. Also, this screen really sucks because you have to be really precise with where you jump to get it between here. And if you fall down, you can go all the way back and then all the way back to the right, and that's a lot of time lost on the timer. Not to mention the bats themselves will respawn. Now, I mentioned earlier already in the video that hearts in this game are just health pickups. So you might be wondering, okay, what's the sub-weapon currency? There are no sub-weapons. Christopher's only attack method is the vampire killer itself, as well as the fireballs you shoot out of it at max power. So you are very limited with how you can attack enemies, but at the same time, enemies themselves are so relatively limited in what they can do, it's not that big of a deal. But they will throw some surprises at you in the form of the boss fights here and again. In this game, you actually have to spawn the boss fights yourself by collecting the sparkling gem at the end of a stage. First boss here is Belmonts. It's a knight that walks forward and then does a chain attack downwards that has a surprising amount of range. Notably, your fireball attack does do good damage against most enemies, but they completely bounce off of that boss fight, so don't rely on them too much. You have to be at a relatively mid-distance to hit that fight. And it can be a little tricky because of that, because if you're a little too close, you're going to lose your power-ups, and that means the fight gets a little more dangerous. Alright, at this point, let's go read the American manual's plot to see what they tried to say is going on. Sheer terror is at hand. To confront the death-defying count, insert the cartridge into the Game Boy and click down the power switch. When Konami appears on the screen, press the start button. Now you're in the misty midst of Dracula's less than welcoming lair. There's no place to hide, no place to run. The only direction you can go is dead ahead into the darkness that is Castlevania. With the taste for sweet revenge at the tip of his fangs, the bloodthirsty Prince of Darkness hungers for a succulent delicacy, and your throat is definitely on his menu. But before you reach this host of horrors, you must risk your neck against multitudes of unearthly evils that lurk around every corner. All told, there are 4 levels of dank dungeons, torture chambers, and vampire crypts. At the dead end of each, you'll find a primary evil who's waiting to terrorize you. Before proceeding to the next level, you must crush and demoralize, not that it has a lot of morals to speak of, this beast. A bit of an unusual name for a boss fight, but we'll take it. At the end of the 4th level, you'll enter the Dead of Night, where you'll come toe-to-toe, eyeball to eyeball with everyone's favorite bloodsucker, Count Dracula. And it's here that you'll either vanquish his midnight powers forever, or be initiated into his vampire core. Your sole means of protection are your Mystic Whip and Mindful Wits, which lead you through Drax's menacing maze. Along the way, be sure to light the candles with the tip of your whip. It's a surewire way to unleash life-sustaining items such as hearts, crystals, and crosses of gold. You begin your quest with 3 lives to spare. At 10,000, you receive a bonus life. For every 20,000 thereafter, you'll be granted another reincarnation. Note, there's a time limit in each stage, and if you fail to destroy the primary evil or Count Dracula before it expires, you'll expire. Won't lie, not that often I run into a plot synopsis in the game's manual that's actively more of a what's the game like kind of deal. I mean, I guess there's loose implications about the plot, but yeah, they kind of just imply this is Simon, but it's not. He was always Christopher in Japan. To the point where when this game's sequel came out, they had to correct it into being Christopher for that game in specific. This screen's pretty rough because as we go throughout this bridge, a lot of the eyeballs are going to be rolling at you. When you whip the eyeballs, they explode. This destroys the bridge. And the gap they leave between them is just wide enough where it's a bit of a terrifying jump every time I make it. So if I remember correctly, the way I first saw this game was in ROM lists on emulation sites in like the mid-2000s, maybe late 2000s. I figured out how to get Game Boy ones going, and I tried it out relatively early because I knew I liked Castlevania, and I quit right around this exact point, actually, if memory serves. The biggest thing is, this game in its structure on paper works completely fine. It's classic Castlevania, just with a lot of things missing because it's pared down for the Game Boy at the time, because of how early a Game Boy game this is, which I'll talk about in a little moment. But to compare, if in the classic-styled Castlevanias that people love, the Belmont struts like walking through relatively warm and kind of thinned-out molasses, in this you are walking through the thickest crude oil known to humanity under 100 times gravity. Slight exaggeration, of course, but Christopher in this game just feels so rough in a way that it's very easy to just play this for 5 seconds and go, nope, I'm good. And I don't blame people who do that. Hell, I was one of them, as I just said, effectively. This is one of the lessest Castlevanias on the classic systems, I cannot lie. Also, a bit of a weird thing to get used to. This game actually doesn't have any staircases. Any vertical screen transitions are done entirely with ropes, which just feels kind of weird. And this part of this stage is also a little bit weird to begin with. Not this exact screen, but this entire portion after the bridges, effectively. We're kind of in a maze. Certain screens will lead you to certain screens exactly, but if you go down different ropes, you might loop around or all that jazz, to a point where it's easy to lose a lot of time here on a first playthrough. Once you eventually get here, though, you're good. This scythe-throwing enemy is effectively just this game's version of Axe Knights. They'll either throw their scythes very low and they'll circle back around, or very high and then they'll do the same thing. Jump over the low ones, then duck, or duck into the high ones, then jump to avoid getting hit. Pretty self-explanatorily. For right now, though, we've reached the Stage 2 boss. These are the Undermoles. I say these because there's 20 of the things. They're going to try and peek out of the holes in the background, but if you stand right about where I am, you can jump to hit the two to my direct left and right, and you can hit the one on the far right with a fireball. The ones that jump out of the hole at the very top are the only ones that can actively stand a chance of hitting you, but because they can't just drop straight down, they do a little somersault downwards, you're going to be pretty safe right here. They just try to come out en masse and hit you effectively, but if you take care of them before they can jump out, they're not much of a threat. This is the easiest boss in the game, but if you let it get going, it can be pretty spotty pretty quick. Admittedly, most bosses and enemies in the game are one-trick ponies, which isn't entirely new to the series. Hell, most of Castlevania 1 is exactly that. But Christopher himself is also a bit more of a one-trick pony because, again, you can only really jump and whip in this game since you have no sub-weapon, so what simple enemies were in Castlevania 1, for instance, they're even simpler here. Now, as far as I can tell, this seems to be largely due to two reasons. For one thing, this is a very early Game Boy title. To give out some relative dates, the Game Boy released Q2 of 1989. This game released Q4 of 1989, so not even half a year had passed by the time this came out in most territories. But also, most of the development staff, who I'll go over in a moment, this was their first Castlevania, and sometimes even their first game. Very few of the main staff worked on Castlevania games before or even after this. Some of them worked on the direct sequel, of course, but largely if they worked on other Castlevania games after this, it was like being an executive producer, I believe, on Rondo of Blood, or a designer on Symphony of the Night. For right now, we moved on to the latter half of the game, and Stage 3 and 4 are a notable difficulty spike over Stages 1 and 2. To the point where if I had gotten this far in my first attempts, I probably wouldn't have gotten much further than this. Starting off, we actually have a Crusher segment right out of Mega Man 4, where obviously the spike ceiling is crushing in. That is instant kill. But there's going to be times where you can either duck beneath things to keep yourself safe like that, or you need to destroy this clockwork pillar that's moving around and causing things to move, which will automatically make the ceiling start to reset itself. Ideally, you want to be as close as you can to that pillar to get as many hits in as you can. But thankfully, once you hit the pillar and destroy it, the ceiling will move back up and stay up until you get within a relative domain of sorts that the next pillar belongs to. But even worse, the next half of the stage or so is auto-scrolling, which people go on and on about that feeling rough to begin with, don't get me wrong. But between the heavy control that Christopher Belmont suffers from, the speed of the instant kill spikes at the bottom of the screen, and some of the jumps they want you to make in this section sucks, just straight up. I hate playing this section in specific. For right now, let's start talking about this game's staff. As well, it's not a very large team, there's some pretty influential people in it. The first category listed are the programmers, which there are two of, Masato Miyagawa and Yoshiaki Yamada. Yamada did work on things like The Goonies 2, Track and Field 2, was in Special Thanks and Quarth and Pop and Twinbee, but was eventually the director of Detana Twinbee, eventually being the producer for Rondo of Blood, and a cooperator in Tokimeki Memorial. Their most recent role was in Dragon Quest XI as a playtester. Masato Miyagawa, though, this was their first project as a programmer. They later became the director of Bucky O'Hare, and if you remember that LP, that means something because that means he is one of the founders of Treasure. So he would later be a programmer on Dynamite Headdy, Alien Soldier Supervisor, Gunstar Hero Supervisor, stretching forward into like Ikaruga and all that, as well as the Radiant Silvergun types. Though his most recent non-port that he worked on was a producer on Sin and Punishment Star Successor. Afterwards, we got the graphic designer, so the outright art team for the game. There are two people credited in that, Koichi Kimura and Nobuya Nakazato. Kimura, this was actually their first project in general, though after this they would later work on things like the sequel as a graphics designer, Special Thanks and Bucky O'Hare, director of McDonald's Treasure Land Adventure, eventually becoming the screenplay person for Guardian Heroes on the Saturn, and was a stage designer for the original Bangai-O. Their two most recent projects, and they eventually left, by the way, to join Treasure, if you can't tell by the Bangai-O credit. They were the director for Wario World, as well as Onimusha Dawn of Dreams, and that is their most recent credit. Nobuya Nakazato, though, they started as a bug checker on Bayou Billy on the NES, then this was the next year. But while they did some more graphics work after this, like scenario map design for Vandal Hearts or graphics for TMNT Tournament Fighter, they largely became a director after this, directing things like Contra 3, Rocky Knight Adventures, Contra Hardcore, the PS2 Contra game, which is the name of is escaping me, eventually becoming as well a producer for the Rebirth games on the Wii. Some of the more recent credits, though, are special thanks in like Bomberman R, Contra Rogue Core, as well as being a deputy manager in Metal Gear Solid 5, for better or worse. We might now be moving horizontally, by the way, but the auto-scrolling's technically not done. We now have to outrun another set of spikes. However, this is a much more dangerous section. In fact, I'd argue this is the hardest part of the game, as the spikes move at such a good click here, where it just gets absurdly straight. And the main reason for it is the amount of ropes we have to climb here, as Christopher's rope climbing speed is abysmal. It feels bad enough going up just to do it for, like, screen progression, but when you're on a time limit like this, even more so than the one at the top of the screen, it just gets unbearable. I guess you could theoretically do some damage boosts and just tank some hits. I don't like to do that myself, but that's just because I like having the fireball. I have had many playthroughs, in fact, I had a lot of things happen like this in testing, where I would get to here in this exact section, and the jumps from these ropes would either kill me or the spikes would get me. This sucks. I hate this. If there's any reason you should maybe play the version present in that collection I was talking about earlier, the 4-in-1 pack, it's that, if memory serves, they increase your movement speed there, so that makes this a little more bearable. On top of that, there is that DX patch, which already also does some things to rebalance that, and I think also fix some of the visuals a little more. Getting back to the game's staff, though, the next category for this game is the sound creators, so the composers, sound effect makers, all that jazz. There are 3 listed: Shigeru Furutake, Hidehiro Funoachi, and Norio Hanzawa. Starting with Fukutake, this is their 3rd project after Battleantis and Rockin' Rage. They were a sound designer for Pop and Twin Bee, as well as on the sound team for Parodius. They are a cooperator at Snatcher and were an audio producer for Police Knots. Afterwards, they were in a lot of special thanks sections for various Tokimeki games before they became the executive producer of the original Silent Hill. Afterwards, they were just largely the production team, though they did some senior designing here and there as well. Hidehiro Funoachi is a bit of an interesting one. This is their 2nd project after being on the sound team for Twin Bee 3 on the NES. And after this, they still did a good bit of sound team stuff like Operation C, Parodius, the sequel to this, Castlevania 2, Belmonts Revenge, Tiny Toon Adventures, Babs' Big Break on the Game Boy, Kid Dracula. But a lot of their late roles were related to openings and video conversions, like digitizing film for both versions of Police Knots, Tokimeki Memorial 1, Gradius Deluxe Pack, and they ended with Nagano Winter Olympics 98 of all things. For right now, time for our 3rd boss, though. This is the Death Bat. It'll walk a little bit at first, but if you hit it, it'll jump into the air and try to either land down or swoop over to try and attack you. It's very reactive, but if you just climb up towards the higher steps here on the right side of the screen, you can hit it from a distance pretty reliably with the fireballs if you still have it on your whip, and kill that boss very quickly. And with that, we're already on to the final stage of the game. This was almost a 2-video LP, but I would have had to cut off in the middle of a stage, and I don't like to really do that unless I absolutely have to, and it's the only option I have. Hence why this is a one-off video, by the way. So this stage starts off a little bit weird in that we got this entry hall area. There's a bunch of night enemies hidden in the background who will only come out to try and attack you as you progress throughout the screen. But they'll come out at points where they're meant to actively surprise you and throw you off guard. Sometimes they'll be in front of you like that one, sometimes they'll be behind you like that one. I do really like this song, though. It's sort of this game's version of Vampire Killer, but it also has part of Heart of Fire from Castlevania 1, which is probably my favorite track from that game that's not named Vampire Killer, so hey, I'm cool for that. It can be a rough play at this point. For right now, though, let's talk about the final of the game's composers, Norio Hanzawa. This is their 3rd project after being a keyboardist for Afterburner 2 and a composer for Quarth. After this, they worked on the Simpsons arcade game soundtrack, the Bucky O'Hare arcade game soundtrack, but then they left Konami to join Treasure, as they were the composer, or one of the composers for Gunstar Heroes, Dynamite Headdy, Alien Soldier, Guardian Heroes, Bangai-O, so on and so forth. A lot of their projects they were on, even being on the WarioWare and Astro Boy Omega Factor music team. Their most recent roles outside of ports of other things are the Bleach games on the DS, Blade of Fate and Dark Souls, Star Successor, Sin and Punishment on the Wii. Then they were weirdly on the music team for Simpsons on the 360. And their most recent role is actively as one of the sound directors for Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, available on your phones. At least I think it's still ongoing. I'm actually not sure if that game has gone offline yet. Afterwards, we reach the final set of credits, which is the special thanks. There are 4 people listed, but we only know who 3 of them are from my research. Eskido, Shinya Sakamoto, and Naoki Sato. There's also Kuro Kotai, which is an alias, but I cannot seem to find anything about who they are at the moment. I'll see if I do more research and see if I can find them by the time I do the second editing pass. Eskido, this was their first actual credit in anything. They were also in Pop and Twinbee special thanks section. Largely, they seem to be in the management side of things, as they're listed as management for The Simpsons, Vendetta, Bucky O'Hare, as well as the Xbox-era Simpsons game. Shinya Sakamoto is another composer at Konami, working on Stinger, the King Kong game we mentioned earlier, Life Force, Jackal, Blades of Steel, Sound Valuation for Snatcher. This is one of the few special thanks credits overall. They were also on Ajax, Quarth, Nemesis, Ganbare Goemon for the PlayStation, as well as technically being credited in Abobo's Big Adventure, just because some of their music was used. Finally, there's Naoki Sato, who is an art person and package designer in general. Did video graphics and visual design for things like Rock'n Rage, Life Force, Top Gun on the NES, Contra, they were in special thanks. They did the title design for Snatcher, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, they did logo design, Simpsons on the arcade, they did package design. Their most recent credit, though, is the package design, once again, for Simpsons on its Xbox 360 Live Arcade release. Now, while I was talking about all that, we went through a part of the stage that I can see some people having issues with. Rooms filled with spikes with platforms needing to jump from one another, but they move where they are. That room, I don't find too bad, at least from what I'm used to, as even with Christopher's stiff controls, he moves at a good enough click where that room's not too big of a problem. The real big problem room set in this stage is towards the end, after this room in specific, as there's just a set of rooms where there's spikes on the walls. And they seem like they're not going to be a problem, but in a pattern, certain ones will stab outwards, and that can damage you right as it is, though they aren't instant kill from my memory. But the annoying thing is you have to use them as platforms, and they come out again so quickly that it might be actually pretty hard to keep up with them due to Christopher's stiff controls, rather. Stiftifer. No, that's his nickname in certain circles. Also, invisible platform and rope there to get the final bonus room in the game. That's the most literal with the usual invisible bonus stair room there is in some of the other games. Yeah, this can be rough. Thankfully, the first room here isn't too bad, but these I'm not the biggest fan of. Plus, the hitbox and the spike themselves can be a little bit iffy due to the speed of the platforms. It's the second room, though, that's really rough because you're in such tight quarters. Usually, it's like every other one, technically, but the timing in which they come out is just uneven enough where you'll get caught off guard at moments like that. Don't like that, but at least they were smart enough not to make that room an instant kill, as I feel like there's a version of this game where those are instant kill, and it's even more aggravating. Oh, hey, look, the first boss fight is a normal enemy. That is weirdly common in Castlevania. Especially in the 90s onwards, now I think about it, once you reach the Metroidvania types. This room isn't too bad as long as you remember that Galban's attack range is deceptively long for the size of the actual animation of it, and that you can't actively attack them with the fireballs. It's a short enough game where you might not forget that, but it's easy to get caught up in the moment and in the flow in one of these games and just have one where I'm like, oh, right, that won't work here. With that said, we're already right before the end of the stage, so it's time to go beat Dracula's ass one more time. So, Dracula in this game's a little bit tricky. I'd say in concept he's hard. His attack is pretty simple, but it can be tough to avoid with Christopher's controls. But also, if you position yourself just right, you can do double damage to him and kill him very quickly. Phase 1's deal is that they'll teleport from platform to platform, firing volleys of 4 shots at a time. 4 will be intercardinal, then it's 4 cardinals, vice versa, until the end of time, really. He's already dead. Phase 2, he turns into a giant bat and hovers at the top of the screen, occasionally letting out 3 bats that move towards the bottom of the screen. The bats are just uneven with their movement and where they're placed, where if you want to stay safe, you kinda need to stick between the 3 platforms I'm hovering around. The one on the middle left and right, and the one at the bottom of the center. And you want to hit him with like the tip of your whip to get the best mileage out of it too, in order to make sure you're safe at most distances. With that said, while I like this music track, again, it's a very easy boss fight, as he's already gone. So that's Castlevania the Adventure. It's short, and it's definitely a little clunky in most regards, even compared to other Castlevania games at the time. For a first attempt at a handheld Castlevania, I'd say it's a strong first attempt, but they definitely hit the ground running more so in the sequels than follow-ups in basically every regard. Largely, I would say avoid this one on the whole and skip straight to the second one, as that is just a much more complete feeling experience and feels closer to like Castlevania 1 and 3. Barring exactly one case, but I'll talk about that whenever I get to that game. Largely, if you're going to do anything with this, I'd recommend messing around with any of the mods for the DX release that are there to make it just a better experience based off the version in the Game Boy Color collection. Otherwise, you're better off avoiding this one outside of maybe the soundtrack or playing its remake that was on WiiWare. If you want to play this, it's on the Game Boy. It has that European and Japan exclusive Game Boy Color version. And on top of that, it was in the Castlevania Anniversary Collection that was released back in 2019. Which, at that point, you're getting that collection for all the other games, so it's, I guess, a neat little bonus. I do love this ending theme a lot, though. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching. Have a great night. Take care. Next time we see Castlevania, I'm either going to be tackling the sequel to this or maybe finally tackling Rondo of Blood. I've been meaning to do that for a while, but technical hiccups keep getting in the way, so I just never end up doing it. Thank you guys for watching. Have a great night. Take care. And I'll see you guys next Let's Play, whatever that may be. See you guys then.